Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here for today's presentation, Trauma, Risk, and Recovery, a workshop for families and caregivers. Today's webinar will also offer valuable insight for professionals as well. My name is Melanie McGackin, and I am representing the Rutgers Community Living Education Project team, usually referred to as CLEP. Rutgers CLEP empowers self-advocates, their families, and the professionals who assist individuals with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities to create lives of choice. The CLEP team provides education, training, and resources about the many possibilities in community living within New Jersey, all free of charge. We recognize that every person's situation is unique, and we take a person-centered approach to providing you the assistance that you need when and how you need it. The CLEP team contacts will be shared at the end of today's presentation, so feel free to give us a call if we can assist you in exploring community living opportunities. Before we get started, let's go over how you can best participate during today's virtual event. To ensure the best sound quality possible, all attendees will be muted at the start of the presentation. This session is a wonderful opportunity to learn about a topic that is not widely enough spoken about. So we encourage you to ask questions, share your thoughts, and encourage you to engage during today's presentation. You can do so by using the Q&A or chat features on your Zoom control panel. If you'd like to ask a question live, simply let us know by using the Q&A icon. Send us a quick message, and we will unmute you during the Q&A session following today's presentation. It's my pleasure to now introduce today's speaker, Melissa Cheplick. Melissa is a senior training and consultation specialist at the Boggs Center on Disability and Human Development. I had the pleasure of attending one of Melissa's presentations and eagerly approached her to share her wealth of knowledge with the families of our community. The CLEP team is grateful that Melissa is here to share her valuable insight of trauma risk along with strategies towards recovery. Please join me in giving a warm virtual welcome to Melissa Cheplick. Melissa, thank you for being here today. I'll hand the presentation over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, everyone at the Community Living Education Project for hosting me today for the session. And thanks so much to all of you for making some time to be together for this nice way to spend a lunchtime webinar for this topic. This is a very broad topic with a lot to talk about, but we do want to be respectful of your time. So if there are other questions or opportunities, I'll be happy to stay on to give us some more insight, but we do appreciate your time and attention for our opportunities for the webinar. And thanks again for having me. So our goal today is to look at trauma risk and recovery, particularly through the lens of people who have disability experiences, especially intellectual and developmental disability experiences. So we'll talk a little bit about the types of events and conditions that may lead to trauma experiences. And we'll also have a chance to talk about healing and recovery. That's the supports part that we want to make sure that we make time for. So I thought we can start with an icebreaker, thinking about some of the statements here and whether or not we think that they are true or not. And the first one's asking us, people may not remember traumatic experiences if they occurred early in life. And since they can't remember or talk about trauma, it won't affect them. Well, we know that that's a myth, right? We absolutely know that that's a myth. I think it's so helpful for us to know, though, that there are some people who hold these things to be true, and that might be a challenge sometimes, especially when we work with folks and we know people who don't have a lot of language skills, right? A lot of language skills and aren't able to articulate and aren't able to explain those things. It doesn't mean that they're not affecting them, right? And I also want to bring our attention to our fourth item here, which I think is so important for trauma assessment and recovery, right? You need to be able to know everything that happened to someone in order to be able to help them. And we know that that's also not the case, right? Sometimes we don't have all the information about people's experiences. We're not doing investigations necessarily, but we are acknowledging and recognizing that there are events, traumatic experiences that impact people's behavior, impact their mood, interfere with their quality of life, and understanding how people feel and what people need is often, more important of a priority than knowing exactly what happened to them. So I also want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 because even though we have resolved what we would call an immediate danger or a health crisis and a health safety crisis that we're experiencing, we know that for many people, particularly people who experience disability, they've also experienced this secondary pandemic of mental health needs as well, right? Grief and loss and transition, and losing people close to them and feeling isolated and having challenges adjusting to social distancing and wearing masks and having restrictions on their social life and on their work life and transportation and relationships. And we also recognize and honor our workforce as well, people who have been working as professionals in support of people who have been affected by COVID-19 pandemic and those mental health challenges. So our colleagues at our sister university center at the University of Minnesota, they worked together with the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals, and they did these great testimonials of direct support staff working in environments and communities, supporting people and their needs through COVID-19. And I wanted to share with us all a couple of these examples so that we can start to get a sense of that trauma experience from that caregiver perspective, which many of us can all appreciate. So I want to listen first to Darian, and let's hear what Darian has to say about his experience working in 2020.
Well, since the pandemic, my life has kind of changed dramatically. My direct supervisor was affected really bad from the COVID-19, and I had to step up and take on her responsibilities as long as mine. And just making sure that everybody was taken care of, making sure the staff was comfortable, making sure I was comfortable coming into work, making sure we were well protected with PPE equipment, and just stepping up to make sure that the 6 individuals that we take care of was first in our priorities. It was a trial. It was pretty difficult, but we managed to pull together. I put together a really strong team, and we really held it down for the last almost 2 months since this happened to us.
So thanks to Darian for sharing his story with us. And I also want us to hear from Sarah so that we can start to maybe listen to a little bit of the differences in the stories that they're sharing to us in these testimonials.
Just knowing that, I have to go in. I have to go in. There's no way that I couldn't do this job. And it's stressful to know that, I could potentially bring something into his home that could hurt him. It's stressful with family and friends who just want to protect everyone. I'm grateful that I have a job, that's for sure.
So those are just a couple of kind of testimonial experiences that we're hearing from people who are really embedded in these experiences of COVID-19 and helping people and being caregivers through this time. And it's a nice opportunity for us to really reflect on how people have really different experiences, right? When I'm listening to Darian, I'm hearing those seeds of resilience really building, having a lot of responsibility, having roles, taking care of and supporting other people and being committed to that was a significant protective factor for him. And then we hear from Sarah, who's really fearful in her job, but also grateful to have a job, and sort of that dichotomy of those feelings existing for her, navigating through those risk factors. So we want to continue to recognize the way that we have all been affected, through this experience of COVID-19. And it's a nice segue to think about, what are the kinds of things that are traumatic experiences to begin with? And so we generally think about event trauma or single event trauma as being a specific individual event where you or someone that you care about, their life or their safety or their health is in danger. So these are things like a death or a car accident, or there might be a specific instance of an accident or an assault or a weather event in the community. These are single event types of traumas. And we contrast those with complex traumas or chronic traumas, where people have the ongoing experience of threat and risk, right? These ongoing experiences of bullying, of violence, of having their lives or their safety or their health threatened, right? Living in constant fear or not being safe in these complex chronic types of events. And then we also looked at the way that we experience trauma, right? Direct trauma, things that happen to us in our own lives, and then vicarious trauma, those are the events that happen to other people. And we see that people have vicarious trauma experiences either through thinking about other people's experiences, watching the news, being a first responder, being a caregiver or support person to someone else, hearing about other people's experiences in therapy, also thinking about intergenerational trauma as a vicarious trauma experience. So we tend to compartmentalize these types of traumas, but we know that they're very much not mutually exclusive, right? A single event type trauma, like a hurricane or a tornado, or an event of violence, right, become complex traumas because of those needs that occur after. Right? If we have a big thunderstorm in our house and our power goes out and our Wi-Fi goes out, there's damage to the house, we miss work for a few days, we don't have electricity, very quickly our single event trauma becomes a complex trauma experience. And so we also know that happens with direct and vicarious trauma too. I love those videos of the COVID-19 pandemic of people who are sharing their experiences, because it so clearly illustrates how direct trauma and vicarious trauma are very closely related. We're affected by the things that happen to the people that we care for and that we care about. And so while we have sort of these definitions to identify trauma experiences, we know that there's a lot of overlap and there's a lot of interconnectedness between these types of trauma experiences for people. And I want to share this graphic where we're looking at stress on a continuum. And you'll see here that we have a gradient of green and yellow and red, really looking at different areas on the stress continuum where we fall. On the left-hand side, we see this normal routine stress of a green level. This is our baseline level of stress. As we move to the right, things get yellow, and these are things that would represent a tolerable but depleting level of stress. We might need our resources, we might need our skill sets, but we're still able to do that. And then on the right-hand side, we're looking at toxic, right? Toxic levels of stress that could potentially lead to trauma experiences and trauma disorders. So I wanted to orient us in space and time on this continuum so we can start to think about where do we fall on this level, right? So I want you to think, and you don't have to self-identify, you can just take this time to reflect. I want you to think about a snowstorm or a thunderstorm where you have no power and no Wi-Fi for 2 weeks, right? No power and no Wi-Fi for 2 weeks. Does this feel normal? Does this feel tolerable? Does this feel toxic to you? We think of other examples such as not seeing our family and friends, maybe for weeks or months at a time. Does this feel normal, tolerable, toxic? Maybe we get a job after we've been looking for so long to find the right job, and then we learn that we're not going to have that job anymore because they shut the place down, or they're working from home now and we don't have that option. Does that feel normal? Does that feel tolerable? Does that feel toxic? Right? We think about going to the doctor. You go to the doctor, you see a health professional because you're not feeling well, and that health professional, that doctor, they're dismissing your symptoms. They're making light of your experiences, right? Does that feel normal? Is that tolerable? Is that toxic? if we have a prescription that we can't afford, if we have a medical procedure or a specialist that we need to see and our insurance isn't covering it, does that feel normal? Does that feel tolerable? Does that feel toxic? And of course, all of our experiences are going to be very different, right? Maybe when you have a snowstorm or you have a thunderstorm that knocks out your power, this is normal for you because you have a generator and you have a lot of extra food and it's not particularly cold out, so it's okay if the heat's not working, right? But for other people who may rely on technology, for people who don't have a generator, who maybe live in rural communities, who don't have access to resources, this very quickly becomes a toxic event, right? Maybe it's very normal for us to not see our family and friends for a few weeks at a time. Very common experience during our COVID-19 pandemic. But we know that for other people, not seeing our friends and family could be tolerable and even toxic to be separated from them. So where we fall on this continuum, and there's so many different examples of this, right? Where we fall on this continuum really is about what are the risk factors we experience, what are the protective factors we experience, and that we experience them very differently, right? For some people, history and experience is a protective factor, right? We know what to do. We've been through this before. We have the resources. We're prepared. For other people, history and experience is a risk factor. It's a trigger. It's a memory. It's a reminder. It's an opportunity to feel threatened and to feel unsafe. So just as we in these experiences recognize that our stress level is dictated by our own experiences with certain events, we know that that is also similar for people that we know and love and support, right? And so we recognize that these are very unique experiences. And unfortunately, very common experiences, right? There's so many possible trauma events for people who experience intellectual and developmental disability. And just as we think about event type trauma and chronic type trauma, we often identify these events as also being sort of a capital T, catastrophic trauma, and then a lowercase t, little t, ongoing trauma. So those big T event traumas like abuse and neglect and racism and segregation and isolation and feeling unsafe and being in danger. Those are big T capital traumas that we know people experience. But we also know more commonly that people with IDD also experience a significantly high rates of this lowercase t trauma, these chronic T traumas where people are experiencing a lot of transition and isolation and moving around and not having friends and not accessing resources, relying on other people to get their needs met, relying on other people for work and relationships and transportation, right? Being segregated and isolated in behavior planning and in school systems and in relationships and in their family. Disparaging language, bias, discrimination. These things are happening constantly, right, in the lives of people who experience disability. So we think about these events as these sort of capital T traumas, and we also recognize that these lowercase t traumas are chronic and that they're happening over time and over the lifespan. I also want to share with us some of our statistics, and this is from the center, the Vera Center for Justice. And these are statistics that depict violence in the disability community for people with disabilities, women, people with cognitive or developmental disabilities, people with psychiatric illness and mobility and other physical disabilities. 1 in 5 people between the ages of 12 and 19 who experience disability report sexual violence. This is not coercion. This is not harassment, not to minimize those experiences, but just to clarify the construct here of sexual violence, right? 1 in 5 people, teenagers, report sexual violence. People are 3 times more likely to experience violent victimization. Disabled people 3 times more likely to experience rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and robbery. These are big T, capital T event type traumas, right? And then we see that statistics are also here for children, 3 times more likely to be sexually abused, more likely to experience abuse and neglect and repeated abuse and neglect. over the lifespan as children. And we bring these statistics to you, unfortunately, not because they're unfamiliar to us, but because it's an opportunity to think about the bigger picture of why this is happening, right? Violence and trauma are more common in the disability community because people with disabilities are not valued, right? They're not valued, they're not respected. Many people live in isolation. People don't have a lot of friends, right? They don't have those support systems and protective factors necessarily. Oftentimes people don't have sexual health or other types of health education to be able to articulate or be able to have the vocabulary to explain these things that are happening to them. People don't necessarily have a good understanding around relationships and healthy boundaries and privacy. Also, we know that people may often rely on others to be their caretakers and provide supports to them, and that puts people in a vulnerable experience. We also tend to value compliance, right? We tend to value compliance when we think about how we interact with folks, right? How can we think about compliance when we are often trying to keep people safe? And there's that balance there of keeping people safe and also requiring this compliance, which can be a risk factor for people who have the expectation of being told what to do. So it's the math, the statistics that we're seeing, but it's also these big picture conditions that we're seeing as a reason. So we think about who's at risk, and the bottom line is that we're all at risk, right? Across our lifespan, across our relationships, right? Because we know that we have all experienced COVID-19. If you are someone like me who is old enough to have experienced 9/11, if we are people who have, violence and danger and challenges in our community, we are all at risk to have a traumatic stress disorder. But we don't all experience a traumatic stress disorder, right? It's this relationship between protective factors and risk factors that really dictate outcomes. When we have protective factors, our outcomes are better. With more risk factors, our outcomes are worse, right? So protective factors being language, relationships, social networks, having supports, using therapy, having education around privacy and sexuality and boundaries. Those are protective factors. And then we have risk factors. Being isolated is a risk factor, right? Not having friends is a risk factor. Relying on other people to get our needs met is a risk factor. Having a secondary mental health condition or other mental health symptoms already, like depression and anxiety and a mood disorder, is also a risk factor for experiencing trauma. So we see that this relationship builds here. And this other key piece around the type of trauma is really important. Because remember, when we're looking at those lowercase t chronic complex traumas that are happening across the lifespan, right, our risk factors increase and our protective factors decrease. We're using up our resources. We're using up our protective factors. And that's also increasing risk for people over time, right? So I wanted to just share with us a couple of tools for diagnosis, not because there's the expectation that we are going to memorize or implement diagnostic criteria. I just wanted to include them as a resource so that we can start to look at the relationship between signs and symptoms. On the left-hand side of your screen, you see the DSM-5. We are in the TR text revision edition of the DSM-5, which is essentially outlining the symptoms that are associated with common mental health disorders. And there is a chapter in the DSM-5, diagnosis of trauma and stress-related disorders. And we'll see that the criteria for PTSD, which is the most common, commonly diagnosed trauma disorder, having that stress-related event, having intrusion symptoms like nightmares and flashbacks, having behavior change based on those flashbacks, right? Being hypervigilant, engaging in avoidance behaviors to avoid those intrusion symptoms, and that this is something that we're seeing over time, right? It's a month later after the event and people are experiencing these symptoms. And then we think about the experience of intellectual and developmental disability. We think about people who may not use language to communicate. And we recognize sometimes that there's a gap in assessment between symptoms, which are things that people experience, and signs, which are things that we can see. And that people don't always have the ability to self-report these things that are happening to them. So on the right-hand side of your screen, you see the DMID, which is a diagnostic manual for intellectual disability, edited by the American Psychiatric Association, along with our colleagues from NADD. And essentially it's focusing on behavioral equivalents of particular mental health conditions, including trauma, right? Including trauma. So we think about what we're seeing, not just relying on what people need and what people are able to tell us. Because we know that if people are experiencing intrusion symptoms like flashbacks and nightmares and unwanted memories, right, that sometimes it can look like psychosis. Sometimes it can look like a hallucination. And oftentimes we overlook or misdiagnose trauma experiences because there is that gap between symptoms and signs. So working in tandem together with this diagnostic criteria to really, just from an everyday perspective, understand what we're looking at, understand what behavior change is telling us. So when we think about trauma-informed supports and having a framework for trauma-informed care, we want to be able to recognize those behavior changes that we're seeing, be able to tell what people are telling us through their signs and their behavior, and trying again to bridge that gap between those signs and symptoms. So one of the primary ways that we know that needs have changed is that behavior changes, right? We often kind of qualify behavior as being challenging behavior, maladaptive behavior, inappropriate behavior, positive behavior, negative behavior. But really, it's the change in behavior that gives us the most information, right? When behavior has changed, it means that people's needs have changed, right? If behavior has changed, it means that people's needs have changed. And we know that the trauma experience can certainly cause people's needs to change, right? If people don't feel safe in certain environments, if people are triggered by holidays or certain times of the year, being in places and spaces that are just unpredictable places, which unfortunately is a lot of the public places where we go, right? We want to do fun things like go to the tree lighting and go to the festival and go to the library and go to the amusement park, but there's a lot of unpredictable things and people that are going on around there, right? And so we think about how trauma sets people up, right? It makes it more likely that people are going to feel unsafe, and that people are going to feel threatened. And then we see the moment, right, that people are hypervigilant, right? And then we know that people can often be triggered by sounds or sights or smells, right? Someone looks like someone who used to hurt them. Someone smells like someone who used to hurt them. There's an environment here. There's too much space. There's not enough space. It makes people feel uncomfortable, right? And that this discomfort and these feelings of being unsafe trigger that behavior change. Again, it indicates to us that people's needs have changed. So by no means an exhaustive list, but certainly an opportunity for us to think about behavior changes and behaviors that may indicate to us of trauma, right? Running away is a huge indicator to us that people feel unsafe, that people feel uncomfortable, that people's needs are not getting met, right? Eating too much, eating too little, hoarding behaviors are associated with trauma, right? Keeping things close to us, being afraid to lose things and people, that can stem from a history of trauma. Poor hygiene, not bathing, refusing to take medication, gaining a lot of weight. I used to work with a young lady who had a history of sexual abuse as a teenager, and by the time she was in her mid-20s, she was over 300 pounds from eating and from being stationary. And that was a behavior that she had learned to protect herself, right? That if she doesn't bathe and if she has a lot of fat on her body, right, she established that people would not touch her, and that she would be safe. And so her eating and her lack of bathing and her hygiene were indicative of trauma history that we knew she had. But we also see these behaviors with folks for whom we do not know that they've had this trauma history. So feeling hypervigilant, feeling unsafe, these are the things that may cause behavior change. And of course, by no means an exhaustive list, right? Changes in sleep and eating, changes in affect and mood, changes in energy. These are indicators of mental health needs. And we just want to kind of be aware that trauma is certainly one of them. I just wanted to take a moment to look at the relationship between trauma and the brain so that we can start to see how these sort of patterns of response develop over time. And what we're looking at here is the limbic system. Like, these are different parts of the brain that are impacted in the trauma response. So we're looking here at the limbic system, and we're looking at the amygdala. This is the brain's emotional computer, the alarm system, right? The first engagement with the brain is with the amygdala. And then we look at the hippocampus, which is the brain storage for our most recent conscious memory. So this is our working memory. This is our cognitive learning center, our experiences, our wisdom, facts that we've memorized. They're kind of here in the hippocampus. And our thalamus is essentially translates sights, sounds, smells that we receive through the body, translates that into the language of the brain. That's what the thalamus does. And then our prefrontal cortex is where information is used to kind of make decisions. So our cognitive processing, our executive functioning, the majority of that takes place here in the frontal cortex. So what happens is when there's a stressor that's introduced, right, the amygdala is activated by stressors, and in the body, we have the release of stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, and this kind of flips on the limbic system. This results in fight or flight or freeze, right? We're familiar with these concepts. So what happens with long-term exposure to trauma is that this cortex is completely bypassed. The rational thought doesn't really kick in. And then if this happens over and over, the fight or flight response is activated, people feel unsafe, and we're getting a higher increase of adrenaline, a higher increase of cortisol. So in other words, it kind of doesn't take much for the body to have that trauma response, because the brain starts to learn that this is what we need to do to stay safe. And another challenge that this presents is that when we have long-term exposure to trauma and stress, that it interrupts learning. It interrupts memory and our ability to complete behavioral tasks, right? When you get up in the morning and you go to your coffee pot, if you're a person who makes coffee, you put coffee in the coffee pot. You don't put coffee in your shoe. You don't put coffee, in your sock, because this is our hippocampus, essentially reminding us these are the things we do automatically. But what happens in a trauma response is that breaks down. And we see that, right? We see that in folks who have challenge with memory, who may have regression in behavioral tasks, and who are very hypervigilant in that fight or flight or freeze response. Our bodies are not designed for repeated or chronic stress, right? Fight or flight is the biological response to acute stress. We were never intended to have long-term prolonged stress of this level. And so we see repeated stress. We see people who vacillate between fight or flight. We see that for some people, they're very withdrawn and disconnected because all the cortisol and all the adrenaline in the world isn't triggering that limbic system anymore, because the hippocampus shrinks and the amygdala gets larger. The amygdala is the alarm system, right? And we see that gets larger, and it causes those fear reactions even when the stressor isn't there. And we know that people experience perceived threats as significantly as they experience real threats as well. So I want to share with you a framework that we take from our colleague, Dr. Karen Harvey, who is a trauma and disability expert through the state of Maryland for many, many years. And she presents to us our 3 keys of recovery when we look at trauma supports and trauma-informed care. And we look at this through the lens of safety, connection, and empowerment. These are the 3 keys, or these are the 3 tenets of trauma recovery that we tend to apply to a disability context. If you look at some other models for trauma, perhaps through the Children's Trauma Network or through SAMHSA, there may be some other keys in here. I think they include engagement as a key. They include collaboration as a key. For this 3-piece key, because it's very advocacy oriented and the goal is for empowerment and for people to have a role in their own recovery and healing. These 3 keys have found to be most successful when working with folks directly. So safety, connection, and empowerment. And I will talk about them in a linear way because we're in a training model. I mean, we sort of want to talk about each of them, but in reality, these things have tremendous overlap, right? You need to feel safe to feel connected, and we need to be empowered to achieve safety. So these things are happening simultaneously. But one helpful way to consider these keys of support is safety are things that we do for people. Connection are things that we do with people. And then empowerment are things that people can do on their own across the lifespan. So that's one way that's kind of helpful for us to kind of break it down. We also talk about safety first because the reality is, right? The reality is that sometimes people are in danger, right? Of chronic and sort of ongoing trauma experiences. Sometimes people are literally in an unsafe environment or an unsafe relationship or an unsafe setting. So we talk about safety first because we absolutely want to make sure we're managing health and safety, but because people need to feel safe in order to be open to these other therapeutic constructs and ideas. So we tend to talk about safety as being our priority. You know, with the understanding that safety is such an individual experience, right? We think about the things that make you feel safe. Maybe you feel safe being at home. For many people, they do not feel safe being in their own home. Maybe we feel safe when someone else is driving us because we don't love driving, but maybe you don't feel safe unless you're the one who's driving. Do you feel safe when you know where your kids are, when your pets are home, when you have enough food in the refrigerator? Temperature makes us feel safe. People make us feel safe, right? Having the things that we want with us, our stuff, our books, our pets, our stuffed animals, right? Feeling comfortable. So we think about those basic level of needs that we all need, but we also think about things that are really specific to people. Because again, that fight or flight or freeze, it's initiated primarily when people don't feel safe, right? So one way to think about this is for whomever we're thinking of and experiences that they might have, really being clear around what safe means for them, right? Having a safe space, having a routine, having some accommodations available. So some approaches to safety, a safe and accessible physical environment, right? Sometimes it's just about minimizing the clutter. Can I reach things? Can I find them? If I leave something, am I going to find it where I left it? Are things going to be where I put it? That's a big key of safety that may be very meaningful to people, right? Providing structure and routine and predictability. We talk about this a lot in disability supports. And the cognitive piece of this, right? The supports piece of this is that when I know where I'm going and who's going to be there and how long it's going to take and what I need to bring with me and how long I'm going to be gone, right? It reduces that anxiety. It reduces that uncertainty. And it also kind of minimizes the cognitive load because we're providing that predictability and structure and routine, not in a restrictive way, but in a supportive way where we're going to give people what they need. And thinking about healthy boundaries, personal space, Maybe we need to have a safe word or a safe signal that people can use, particularly in environments and settings where we know that people may have experiences that they would feel unsafe, right? Maybe it's around certain people, maybe it's in certain tasks, maybe it's when we go out and we don't know who's going to be there and what to expect. We have the option to leave. We have a way to communicate that to each other so that we can go ahead and achieve that safety. And then the second piece that we talk about is connection, right? And this is important always because we want people to feel like they belong. And we want people to have valued social roles in their relationships. But also the reality being that for some people, they have experienced trauma directly from someone that was intending to help them, right? Someone that they trusted to help them has hurt them and has contributed to that trauma experience. So it's very difficult to make those connections and build trust and friendship when people have those trauma experiences. But we also know that when our world gets bigger, our life gets better because there's more people in it. And so this piece of building connection is a huge factor when we think about making those connections with people, right? And really making activities meaningful. I love this graphic here on this slide. It reminds me of the Hitchcock film Rear Window, but from a much more positive place. But I think about how in the community, our neighbors, sometimes we don't know who our neighbors are, but they're there. And maybe there are places where we can make connection. I never knew that this gentleman liked to exercise, and I never knew that this woman liked to read, but we go to the library and I see her there. And now we're taking walks after school and after work, and I'm seeing some of these folks that I wouldn't see otherwise, right? So really thinking about, you know, being a real part of the community, learning what the community has to offer, thinking about that healthy risk taking where we're trying new hobbies and thinking about new interests, and recognizing that people have needs, right? People have language needs, people have mental health needs, people have mobility needs and transportation needs, and there's fiscal barriers and there's time barriers. And so when we are intentional about making these activities really meaningful, we're thinking about how we can build in these accommodations, right? Well, I need to sit at the back because I need to be able to get out as quickly as possible. Good. We know that we can build it in, right? I need to go to a place where there's a bathroom, but there can't be any stairs to go to the bathroom because sometimes I need to go to the bathroom really quickly and I won't have time to go on the stairs, right? I want to go to a place where I can meet people, but I don't want there to be loud noises there, or I don't want there to be, you know, a lot of commotion, right? So we kind of take these needs into account as we start to think about what these connections might look like, right? And also that we're very intentional about kind of getting into this inner circle of looking at our friends. Our colleague, Dr. Harvey, had done a study through Baltimore County in Maryland, looking at people's experiences with friendship. And they asked, I think it was like 400 people in Baltimore County, how many friends do you have? Not Facebook, not Instagram, not Snapchat, right? But your real friends. How many friends do you have? And most people said on average 5 or 6 friends. Some people said 4, some people said 12, some people said 2, but on average, the typical population of a cross-section, sample size in Baltimore County, 5 to 6 friends. And then she spoke with people who experience intellectual and developmental disability, who were being served through their service system through Baltimore County. And she asked, how many friends do you have? And most people said 1, right? Most of those people said 1. And many of them were referring to a paid caregiver, a roommate, a classmate, or somebody that they work with, right? So I think that it's helpful for us to be very intentional about what we mean by creating connection and having friendships, because in that outer circle of exchange, we need that too. Like, where do you pick up your prescriptions and buy your groceries, and the person who fixes your car, and maybe someone helps you with your lawn, and you have a dry cleaner, right? We're exchanging things there, and they're services and supports that we get in the community in this circle of exchange. And then closer, we have our circle of participation, right? If we have therapists, if we have doctors, if maybe our clergy, or maybe our are people that we rely on, right, in that circle of participation, but there's still a power imbalance there, right? Even though we're closer to friendship, there's still a power imbalance there because one of us kind of needs something else from the other. But then we look at this circle of friendship. And this is where we really want to cultivate relationships and thinking about having, not having those power imbalances, but really thinking about sharing our gifts and talents and who we are with other people and taking that from them as well in this circle of friendship, right? Which is very important when we think about trauma response and trauma recovery. And really listening to people, making time for conversation, whether that is things that we're doing with verbal, expressive, and receptive language exchange, or we're just spending time with people, listening to music or participating in things that are meaningful to them. We can communicate to them that we're kind of listening to them and validating, understanding where these emotions are coming from. And this goes back to why we kind of look through that trauma of the brain, right? That trauma of the brain where we know that people may be flooded with cortisol, they may be flooded with adrenaline. It may be really difficult for people to manage those fight or flight responses. So kind of building these things intentionally in to start to really help people feel safe and to help people feel connected. In the last piece that we talk about, and again, we talk about it in a linear way, but it's not less important, is this idea around empowerment, right? What skills, what resources, what opportunities do people need to kind of take that active role in their own recovery and in their own healing process? And, you know, we're talking about real choices, having a risk involved, being able to change where we live and where we work and who we see, you know, not having to ask for that change so many times, knowing what those risks are, how to initiate change, right? That is the basis of empowerment. And we also think about the choices that we make that kind of impact our identity, right? Our self-image, our identity development is happening from the cradle to the grave, right? Across the lifespan. When we are young, we tend to identify with our parents, our family, our older caregivers. When we're adolescents and young adults, we tend to identify with our peers and people who are equal with us. And then eventually our own identity grows from our values, our accomplishments, our relationships, our mistakes, right? And we get into our own identity through those experiences. So there's a risk for people who experience trauma, and there's a risk for people who experience disability to not have this opportunity for identity development in a positive way, right? And that people may very well be more aware of what they are not rather than what they are, right? I'm the person with a behavior plan. I'm the person who's not allowed to go. I'm the person who doesn't have a driver's license. I'm the person whose younger brother is going out to prom and graduating and going off to school, and I'm not doing those things, right? So being really intentional about helping to find those ways that people can develop their identity and value is a good practice in general, but particularly when we think about how that might have been fractured through those trauma experiences. I'm sharing with you here, and you'll have it in your handouts as well, this beautiful roadmap that Dr. Harvey created around happiness, right? I think that things like being happy, feeling safe, being valued, having relationships, they can be very nebulous concepts, and we want to work together to make sure that we're operationalizing them in a person-centered way. What makes you happy? What does that look like? Where does your value come from? How do we highlight and create experiences for people to build up that identity development of their accomplishments and their relationships and their talents and those valued social roles that they have in their neighborhoods, their families, their relationships? So I share this with you here as a link, and we'll also include it in the slides for you so that you're able to kind of look at this, just one tool for us to think about identity development which can be used through the lens of trauma. It's also really helpful for grief and loss if people are experiencing grief and loss, which is a significant source of trauma. People die and relationships end and people go away. And that's a very heavy, difficult concept for anyone to manage and to work through, but particularly people who may need a little bit more support with that. So definitely check out these tools, and I hope that they'll be helpful for you. And of course, we look at wellness, right? We tend to look at health through a very physical health way. You know, the medical model dictates that we look at health and physical health primarily. But also we tend to focus a lot on physical health because we can see it and because we can measure it. So it's helpful for us to think about wellness in the way that we are creating opportunities with metrics around these other areas of health, right? I know what I weigh and my BMI and our height and our weight, how many steps we took, how much water we drank, our blood pressure, our blood work. There's metrics for physical health in a way that there aren't always metrics for these other areas of health. So here's just some examples of some wellness indicators to really support in building up those other areas of health and wellness around social, emotional, spiritual, financial, intellectual, academic, environmental health. So we share these with you as well. And also that maybe we are not going to be able to do everything, right? Sometimes we don't have all the answers and we don't have all the information, but being able to connect people to therapy, to group work, support groups have been very successful in trauma recovery, particularly for people who experience disabilities, particularly for young people who experience disabilities. There's a pro-social component to support groups where people feel validated by other people's experiences. Support groups are also really useful and helpful so that, you know, we think about hearing other people's experiences, right? And you don't need to have a high level of expressive language to be able to take in receptively other people's experiences. So support groups have been found really helpful in trauma recovery. And also we always think about medical evaluation, ruling out those organic causes. I think that's the challenge that we're all up against, which is that when we see behavior change, the biggest key is knowing that needs have changed, but it can be hard to identify where that's coming from. And we want to focus really on helping people based on need. Some of these tools really help us do some of that. Thinking about medical evaluation, nutrition, sleep, wellness, exercise, all the things that we can think about to connect people with towards that holistic view of health. So I want to just take the last few minutes that we have to share an example with you that you may find helpful, but also helps us to look at how we apply these 3 keys to recovery. And we're talking about this in a trauma-informed context, but this is also a very helpful framework when we think about crisis intervention and management, thinking about behavioral health, thinking about nutrition and physical health. This idea of balancing out those risk factors and protective factors, right? Risk factors are vulnerabilities and things that make life harder. Protective factors are those things, those supports, those opportunities that make life easier. And we always strive for that balance to help people kind of, you know, have a better life through those protective factors. So we look at that balance of protective factors and risk factors, looking at these 3 keys to recovery of safety, connection, and empowerment. And I want to share this story of Marianne. Marianne's 24 years old. She lives in an apartment with 2 roommates. She experiences Down syndrome, anxiety. She's very healthy and social. She has this great job at a plant nursery, watering flowers, organizing the greenhouse. She likes to go shopping with her sister. She likes to go to farmers markets and be critical of their setup of their plants and their vegetables because she's so good at that stuff. She likes to go out to eat. She uses short sentences to communicate. She's very comfortable when she knows what to expect. And she has that clear pathway. So Marianne confides that there's a history of being teased by other students. Now, she hasn't been in school in some time, but when she was in school, she was called names. She was told that she was stupid and ugly and really other disparaging language. And sometimes when she's at work, a customer will ask her a question and she can't answer it. And she hears those voices in her head of her old classmates telling her that she's not good enough, telling her that she's stupid. And so she runs to the greenhouse and she cries to avoid those bad feelings. Sometimes she skips work, right? She skips work for days at a time because she's feeling so vulnerable, right, from this experience. So I like this example of Marianne because I know her and I'm sharing this with you. And we also think about this framework, right? Thinking about safety, connection, and empowerment, how we can build this safety in for her, thinking about those protective factors and those risk factors. And we see that some great protective factors is that Marion has this job, you know, that she has her sister, that she is really good at this job and she has the ability to use short sentences when she's prepared with what to expect. So in these moments when she's asked a question that she's not able to answer, is it helpful to have a script? Is there someone else that she can help at work, right? Can she say, hey, can I have 5 minutes and I'll get back to you? Can we also think outside of the setting where she's struggling and think about wellness, think about therapy, think about being able to share her gifts of working in this environment with other people, really building that safety and connection, and building up her empowerment, right? It's okay if someone asks you something at work and you don't know the answer. What can we do? Do we have coping skills? Do we have a script? Can we just go to the greenhouse anyway without kind of screaming and crying and feeling insecure, but saying, okay, let me think about this. Let me find someone else to help you. So this is a very abridged version of an example that I hope that you'll find helpful. But I wanted to just share that, you know, we see trauma experiences across the lifespan, maybe happening in the future for things that we might not be aware of. Also kind of going back to that first slide of what is a myth and what is a fact. People are not necessarily constantly in fight or flight or freeze for some of these events to be still impacting them in a negative way. So it's sort of helpful to be able to recognize trauma is contributing to that behavior change. I wanted to make sure that we had an opportunity to look at some collaborative approaches, right? Thinking about, again, balancing out risk and protective factors and doing that intentionally and doing that in advance, right? The more community supports we have, the more people have safety, connection, and relationships, right? The less burden it is on people to kind of get there for themselves. I know some questions in the chat around resources or around references. Here are some references that we are including here. Also, all the things that I'm sharing with you that Dr. Karen Harvey has done are free and available and downloadable in the NAD website. So I've included that for you here as well. And some other immediate resources that we can use to check in on things. If people are in immediate danger or need immediate attention, there are some immediate resources here as well. And also our new website at the Boggs Center on Disability and Human Development, where we can find some of the additional information and resources that we have through our partnership with the Boggs Center and through CLEP. So I will kind of stop officially here so that I can allow us to get the information that we need from the Community Living Education Project and all of the contact information here for Melanie and her team. And also to make sure that we are mindful of your time in completing the evaluation. You have a QR code on your screen and you have the link to the evaluation as well. Both of these things will take you to the same place. And on behalf of Melanie, I thank you in advance for taking a moment to complete the survey. So as we're doing that and with the time that we have left, if there are some other questions or there are some other items that we want to discuss, we can certainly do that now.
Melissa, thank you so much as always. As I mentioned earlier, just not a topic that is often enough spoken about. So greatly appreciate you taking the time yet again to share with the community all the resources and specifically some of the guidance in regards to recovery, right? I think it's really easy quite often for us to identify a challenge, but how to take steps to help address that challenge is quite often the missing piece. So we thank you so much for your positive strategies that you were able to share today so that others can then pursue further as they wish. So we do have a few questions coming in.
Sure. I wanted to just bring to our attention, Melanie, that I don't think folks might be able to grab the link from the slide. So if we can just go ahead and get that in the slide for people who are not able to use the QR code, I think that would also be helpful.
Absolutely. And I do have it scheduled that as we are saying goodbye today, it's going to pop up automatically on your screen.
Okay, great. That's wonderful. That's also very helpful as well.
But this
My
is
contact
perfect.
information, I'm sorry, my contact information is here on the Boggs Center website. I'm very easy to find. It's my first name dot my last name at rutgers.edu, as it is for our School of Public Health colleagues as well. And we are, of course, sharing the slides with you.
Wonderful. And Melissa, was your email address in the slide itself, or do you want to drop that in the chat
I
section?
certainly will do that right now for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we do have some questions coming in. I do want to be conscious to keep the questions as general as possible. And then if someone is looking really for some specific guidance, reach out to CLEP if it's within that residential realm, or by all means, Melissa's going to also share her contact as a resource, anything specific to trauma and recovery. So the first question we have coming in is someone's looking for resources for a therapist. This person is supporting a young lady with a trauma history who is dealing with grief of losing her mom and does not understand her feelings. Can you talk a little bit about, I think that's sort of the big question today, right? How do people identify therapeutic approaches that work with individuals who may not communicate verbally the way that and I think a lot of the families today are seeing that as a challenge for some of the individuals to effectively participate in some of those therapeutic recovery approaches.
Yeah, I think that there's still, a lot of challenge with identifying. I know that the questions that we're getting and many of the questions that we always get all the time is, where do I find the person who does this? Where do I find that person who does that? And Melanie, it's very difficult to find providers, and even more so difficult to provide providers with expertise. One thing that I tend to tell people who are closest to the work, and the people who are closest to the work, I mean, you, family members, caregivers, direct support professionals, is that no one's more of an expert than you in this person and this situation. And sometimes when we don't find expertise, we sort of have to build that expertise. For example, I have a team that I work with that they went to the psychiatrist and they brought the DMID-2 and they said, this is what's happening, right? These are the signs that I'm seeing. These are the behavioral equivalents that I'm seeing. So sometimes we have to educate people to make sure that the people that we love are getting the things that they need. I also think that when people experience, grief or loss, it's sometimes very difficult to understand what they're going through and not being able to articulate it. But like, what are the things that we do to feel better through grief and loss? Like, what are some of the best practice responses that we have when people are going through grief and loss? I would say specifically to this question that while I don't have the name of a therapist to tell you to go to, unfortunately, I would really recommend that you do use that goodbye book from Dr. Harvey. It'll be the last link here on this page to kind of go through those ideas of grief and loss with people, and that this is going to be very different for people. Sometimes people scrapbook and they have pictures, and it's very therapeutic for them to go through these pictures and talk about the person that they loved and what did you love about them. And when I say talk, I mean communicate, not necessarily verbally. For other people, they might not be in that process, right? They might not be ready to talk about those things as well. So I think it's just a matter of when we can find resources, using them, and that if we have resources that we know are helpful and useful in work, we may need to share that with other people, right? Even if they are, therapists and other health professionals who may not know your son or daughter or brother or person you support, better than you do.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to also understand that quite often, and I will raise my hand and say as a parent, I've done this myself. We are quite often saying what professionals work with individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities. And there are opportunities where it is someone who works with any and everyone in the community, right? Not only people with intellectual developmental disabilities. And I think us knowing our loved ones typically the best, and those caregivers who have supported them for, some time, can provide some guidance on modifications to support people to have meaningful engagement and interactive, right, during these interventions and recovery practices, to actively participate in different kinds of therapy and therapeutic approaches. So, whatever that is going to look like for your loved one, we so often, Melissa, as you mentioned before, right, sometimes it's using pictures that is really effective for people, but we so often are discounting individuals' participation because their verbal skills are not that most people would think that they can, right, effectively communicate their feelings. There's other ways for that to be done.
Yeah, Melanie, I think you bring up a really excellent point, is that we tend to say, there's not a professional expertise for a person who has autism and grief, a person who doesn't use language and has depression, a person who has had trauma, but may not, may have cognitive or developmental challenges. And I think what you're pointing out, which is where is the best practice, and how do we adapt that in a person-centered way to this person, to my person, and what they need, right? Because it's sometimes it's not an unwillingness to provide the therapy. There might be an inability or a lack of skills or knowledge in how to do that. But that doesn't discount the best practice that exists in the community, right? That there are pockets of best practice, and we know the things to support grief, we know the things to support trauma, we know the things that provide good mental health and wellness. We're likely not going to find someone who's going to say, okay, we're going to plug this through a machine and it's going to come out on the other side as being disability friendly, right? Unfortunately, that's just not the reality. But how can we take those areas of best practice and then specifically accommodate it to this person and their needs? I think that's a really excellent point.
And again, we have multiple questions coming in, really looking for that very specific answer. And unfortunately, we do not have that answer for everyone today. What I will say is, I know that I have listed in the chat section, and actually, Melissa, could you just go back to the CLEP contact page real quick?
Absolutely, of course, yeah.
So on this page, you'll see my contact along with Natalie Trump. Please reach out to Natalie. One thing I will say is that we will reach out to different professionals that we know to see if there are any additional resources that we can point you in the right direction. We don't know what that right fit is going to be for you or your family member, right? Today's session was not a consultation. It was to provide information and guidance on some effective, positive best practices. So we are building the foundation today for you to then explore some additional opportunities. But again, we would be more than happy to reach out to some of the professionals to see if anyone has any more specific resources to provide to you. So please feel free to reach out to Natalie if you would like to, touch base further in regards to some resources. Again, and also in regards to community living options. That is something that CLEP really specializes in. Melissa, what would be appropriate for someone to reach out to you for? Is in regards to a family member or professional who's joining today's call?
Yeah, I think that that's a great opportunity for us to talk about sort of what the Boggs Center is. The Boggs Center is our university center for excellence and disability in the community. Through federal legislation, there is a university center in every state. We are your university center in the state, and by definition is to connect people to education and training and resources. So we don't provide direct support services at the university center. We do research, we develop training, we distribute training, we do cross-educational training. So we have our instructors who teach at the School of Public Health and webinars like this, our community providers, the School of Social Work. So we're education and training, which is our primary resource. So if we have resources and publications and training that would be helpful for you, we're happy to share them and through training opportunities like this. But as far as connecting people directly with the provider, that's not something that we're able to do through the Boggs Center.
Absolutely. And again, I sit here today as a member of the CLEP team, the Community Living Education Project, but also sit here today as a family member. And as a family member who has had to navigate the process of finding the right resources. With that being said, right, as parents, caregivers, as possibly self-advocates who are also on the call, we encourage you to reach out to every and any professional that is supporting you and your family, right? We are often finding out the best information from other family members. We are finding information through our support coordination agencies, our support coordinators, along with their supervisors. So if you have a need, tap into any and every resource that you have to see if they have an appropriate resource for you. So please know that we are here if we can provide any additional guidance. And I really hope that this information allowed you some positive guidance on some of those better recovery suggestions.
Yeah.
Melissa, any
And I
closing
think
thoughts?
also one thing, Melanie, that you remind me of is that, you know, we sort of talk through some of these things of safety, empowerment, and connection as being things that we might take for granted and assume that these are going on in people's lives. And I would say the majority of the things that we talked about in this session today are things that we can and could be doing all the time, right? Helping people feel safe, giving people opportunities for safe space, connecting people to making friends and hobbies, having those building skills for empowerment, and just all these other things we talked about today around health and wellness, nutrition and diet. These are very everyday accessible things that we want people to have and experience, right? So I don't want people to leave here discouraged thinking that if I don't find a professional to do these things, they're not going to get done, because a lot of these things are things that we, as our colleagues are pointing out on the call, right, we want to make sure that we're doing these things, and this conversation is good. It's a good place to start the reminder. And also, to your point, there's only so much we can do in training space with all of our needs here at the same time. This is a great place to start, and I really I appreciate you inviting me to start the conversation.
No, thank you so much. And we do have someone who is actually pointing out I think the more we talk about a need, the more the professional community is going to recognize that there is a need for specific resources. So keep sharing by all means. And again, please reach out to us if there's any information that you need. As we are preparing to say goodbye today, you're going to notice a really brief survey pop up on your screen. It takes about 20-30 seconds to complete that. It's the information that you provide to us that allows us to better serve the community moving forward. Melissa, I cannot thank you enough, and the Boggs Center, for sharing your time and expertise. As a parent, I greatly appreciate you and your dedication to this topic. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a lot to say in a brief time, but I really appreciate everyone's attention and your thoughtfulness in the comments.
Thank you, everyone. Please be well. Enjoy your holidays. Thanks.